Good morning, everybody. So this is a workshop on algorithmic bias in healthcare. I know the other speakers have touched on the issue of bias, so this is a deep dive on the bias issue in healthcare. And it's a deep dive, not on the technology, but on the management side, on the management decisions that I believe lead up to some of the bias issues. Hopefully, by the end of this presentation, you will be convinced that there are many, many management decisions that lead to the symptoms of bias that we're seeing out in industry. So just a little bit about me. So my background is in industrial engineering with an MBA. I teach at the Schulich School of Business at York University, which is what my background is showing. I've worked in a lot of public and private sector organizations, including CAMH, Ontario MD, Ontario Telemedicine Network, eHealth Ontario. Those are the healthcare examples. And I'm also a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Toronto. These are my research interests: blockchain, AI, open data, diversity, social and environmental impacts of technology projects. And about the workshops. So maybe 3 sections. So we'll talk about the symptoms of the problem that we're seeing in public press articles. We'll do a deep dive into the root causes. We'll unpack those layers of business decisions and strategy decisions. And then finally, we'll talk about some strategies and tactics that project managers and middle management can use to mitigate some of these risks. So this is going to be a discussion-oriented workshop. You can ask questions at any time. You can raise your hand or put them in chat. I'll try and keep an eye on both of those. But you'll see after like every few sort of group of slides, I have a bunch of questions for you to kind of spur that discussion. So let's talk about the symptoms of the problem, right? These are the headlines that you see in the public press articles, right? Forget the academic articles, right? This is out in public. Healthcare algorithm offered less care to Black patients, right? And you know, as the article points to, so there are decisions about data. So again, both of those are important, right? So one, people kind of hone in on the data piece. Also remember the decision piece, right? Here's another one. Racial bias found in a major health care risk algorithm. Black patients lose out on critical care when systems equate health needs with costs. So let's look at I just showed you the headlines. Let's just look at the details of some of these articles and what they're pointing to. So in this particular case, and I'll provide the PowerPoint with the links to all participants. So you can, if you're interested in a particular article, you can always go to the link and read out. So I'll just highlight some points from the articles. So algorithm study did not take account of race when estimating a person's risk of health problems. So software was designed to predict patients' future health costs as a proxy for their health needs, right? So the proxy concept is important. So if you're saying, hey, how many dollars did we spend on each person? That's a predictor of how many dollars they will cost for the healthcare system. So we need to intervene and, you know, maybe provide preventive sort of care and so on. But so the problem is when you're using this proxy data, as in the dollars spent, the hospital uses risk scores to select patients for its complex care program. It was selecting patients likely to cost more in the future, not on the basis of their actual health, right? So that cost, which is a proxy, is not always a good proxy for the actual health conditions. And so this is a common measure, right? So it's not like somebody came up with a measure that nobody else uses. So algorithms designers use previous patients' healthcare spending as a proxy for medical needs, a common benchmark, right? So they're following industry practice, as many people would say. In this case, however, the researchers found this proxy arrangement did not work well because even when black and white patients spent the same amount, they did not have the same level of need. Black patients tended to pay for more active interventions, such as emergency visits for diabetes or hypertension complications, and so on, right? So there's this whole kind of racial dynamic in that data. So in practice, in the real world, that's algorithm didn't account for. So to make this a little more interactive, just given those headlines and a couple of, I didn't ask anybody here come to the workshop to do a bunch of pre-reading or anything like that, but given those headlines and given the sort of points you point out, and most of you being in the healthcare industry, having come across many of these issues, anybody, can you identify the cause of the issues, the cause of the bias in this particular example? You can put in a chat, or you can raise your hand. Bias in the data set. Okay, good start. So the next question. So what would you do? So you know the problem. You've seen the problem being kind of laid out. Is there one important area that needs to be reviewed and can be improved on? If you're working for this company, if you're working for another company, developing similar products, anybody have any ideas on what's an important area that you could improve on? Let's try to find something. Okay, yeah. So you're gonna separate those, black and white, men and women, kind of, yeah. So you're working towards solutions. How about, and you don't have to have answers to these, did they include the right stakeholders in the planning for the project? Somebody would have identified the issue. Were there the people with the right skill sets assigned to this project? Were the risks for the project appropriately identified and assessed before the project started? So remember, with the risks, you got to identify them before the project starts, not after you put in production. And were the processes and practices appropriate for these projects? Again, these are rhetorical questions. You don't have to have answers for these. We'll kind of deal with them as we go along. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a deep dive into the root causes. And where I want to move your kind of frame is from this issue being a data issue to a diversity issue. So you might say, okay, why would this be a diversity issue? And here are the next few slides that explain why this is a diversity issue. The data issue is in the back. If you kind of go past that data layer, it's a diversity issue. So here's the business case for diversity, right? So McKinsey has done studies. So like over thousands of companies, over thousands of countries. So somebody's asking about, hey, in Canada, we don't collect this data. Is it good to be blind? So yesterday I was attending the ICML conference, and the statement, which I think applies here, is so just a lack of knowledge of bias is not an excuse not to fix the issues, right? So every system we have has biases, and we can kind of talk about it later, whether you're collecting that data attribute or not. Whether you're collecting that data attribute, specific data attribute, race, gender, whatever. Even if you're not collecting the data attribute, your system has biases. So going back to the slide here, so the business case for diversity has been proven, over thousands of companies, different industries, different countries, and this is one example of a report by McKinsey that says, hey, here are the benefits of two kinds of diversity. On the left-hand side, gender diversity, right-hand side, ethnic diversity. And here is the performance, like the financial performance, right? Which is what most people care about. That, hey, the more diverse organizations, companies do better on these metrics, right? So that's the business case for diversity. Where I want to take this, so you said, oh, you might ask the question, so what kind of diversity are you talking about? Just kind of different kinds of people, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, inability, and so on. And where I want to go to is Scott Page, and he's a professor at NYU. And this is the question we want to ask when we're coming across these examples, these symptoms of AI bias in healthcare, in any sort of industry. Why did we make this mistake? Is it because we didn't have somebody in the room who would have seen this? That's the connection I want you to make between, hey, it's a data issue, to it's a diversity issue because you didn't have the person in the room to identify the data issue. If there was a person in the room that identified the data issue, you'd have identified it and fixed it. But this is a system that was put into production in a hospital, right? So obviously there's nobody along the whole chain of decisions that even identified the issue. You didn't have the right people in the room, right? Scott Page was a little bit further saying, hey, it's not enough to say we'll have external diversity, right? So, as long as we hire, people who are men and women, people from different ethnic backgrounds, will be fine. He says, well, hold on. In addition to that, you need cognitive diversity. So you need people that think different. And he says cognitive diversity, he means people that think different. So is it, you might get that free, just by hiring people who are, outwardly different, or between men and women, between people of different ethnic backgrounds, but it's not automatic, right? You need people, especially again, when we're solving problems of AI bias, when we're developing any kind of software system, we always need people who think different in the room on the project to identify those problems, those risks that nobody else in the room is even seeing. It's a blind spot, right? Unless you have that personal experience or have that knowledge, you're not going to see it. So the particular case study we're talking about on LinkedIn, you can look at the sort of profile of employees, right? So I went to the LinkedIn and looked at the profile of Optum employees. Would they have had this diverse team? And looking for the type of diversity Scott Page talking about, cognitive diversity, people who think different. What do I see? So this particular company and the Optum and the insurance company is part of is based in the Minneapolis, St. Paul's area, right? So what do you see in terms of a trend for what universities, what educational institutions do employees for this particular company come from? So I see University of Minnesota, University of St. Thomas, Minnesota State University, University of Minnesota Duluth, so local universities, right? Probably similar programs, healthcare informatics, data science, probably. So, and also I'll point out this company has a sort of branch or department in India. So, which is why you see Jawaharlal Nehru Technological University, right? So you can say, hey, we're diverse. We have, a bunch of team members from US, we have a bunch of team members from India. That's like a lot of diversity, right? And I'm like, not the right kind of diversity. If they're coming from the same university, same programs, that's not cognitive diversity. That's not people who think different. That's probably people who think the same, right? So let's dive into this issue of cognitive diversity, what kind of diversity you need on the team. So for this particular piece, I'm going to go to Ushnish Sengupta, who's a practitioner. He's not an academic like Scott Page. He's a practitioner, right? Worked for the Microsoft's AI group, but more importantly, the way I met him is through the Montreal AI Ethics Institute. He's the founder and does a lot of great work there. So in an interview with him, he talks about these issues we're talking about, and specific to healthcare, right? Specific to AI in healthcare, right? So he says, look, so the problems are with secondary data use. So remember, you use that whole bunch of data available from the hospital on costs per patient, and you use that as a proxy, which is industry practice, but still problematic. The underlying assumptions are unstated, right? So the assumption, when you just get a bunch of this cost data for patients and you use it as the training data, or even the kind of production analysis data, the assumption is, yeah, black and white patients, they're the same, treated the same, or men and women, they're treated the same. That's a really bad assumption, right? So we don't know what decisions were made in the data collection process when those costs are being incurred between black and white patients, between men and women. they were being incurred on a different basis. So when the data was being collected, we do not know the assumptions, right? So it's a whole bunch of assumptions that go on behind data collection that we need to, A, we need to know about, and B, somebody needs to be able to flag that problem, which is the other part he talks about in the same interview, is look, it's beneficial to have two kinds of people that can provide guidance on that. One is clinical expertise. All of us know this. Anybody who worked on any healthcare project, you know, you need that clinical expertise. One is the clinical expertise to understand the domain specificities. For example, someone who knows the difference between men and women, it differs between people of African descent versus Asian descent or whatever. The second would be someone in the social sciences. And this is something that doesn't happen as frequently as someone who can give that intelligence in terms of the demographic mix of what the general distribution might look like, the social determinants of health, like, yeah, so when black and white patients come in, so black patients come in when they have more severe conditions because of the social determinants of health, right? And so this is where, again, back to that diversity question. So what he's recommending specifically for AI healthcare, AI and healthcare projects, is that you need these kind of, they don't have to be full-time team members, they can be advisors, maybe even external people you put on contract or retainer. So it's pointing out to that need for people who think different, people come from the social sciences and are knowledgeable about these issues like the social determinants of health, right? And it's not purely a clinician. Sometimes the clinicians don't know all the social determinants of health. They also have to take classes in school to learn them, right? It doesn't come automatically. You realize all these differences. You have to be trained. You go to, whether you take it through courses or through other methods, this understanding of social determinants of health, differences between men and women, different backgrounds, different abilities, and how that plays out into healthcare and healthcare data. In that case, it takes a training, it takes work. It doesn't kind of come automatically. Right? So between those two sort of points being made, one by Professor Scott Galloway saying that you need cognitive diversity, people who think different, and then Abhishek Gupta saying, look, what the kind of difference you need is people who come from the social sciences and are able to identify those issues. You need them on your team to identify the issues, because otherwise the rest of the team, they think the same. So hope you can make that connection between those two things. Okay, so you might say, okay, so I understand that. So I understand that, hey, to identify those issues in data, which we said, hey, the symptoms are the data, issues are data. We need the diversity on our project teams to identify the issues, because our regular project teams don't have the people, don't have that expertise to identify the issues. Otherwise, we wouldn't be putting out these systems into production day after day, right? Without biased kind of systems out there. If we had the expertise on the teams, we don't. We might say, hey, that will increase the cost for projects. You know, it's a human resource. You're essentially recommending we add maybe a couple of human resources. You're recommending we add to our project teams. That'll increase the cost of the project. And that's an issue. So I'm going to say that's that cost, that preventive cost that you're adding to identify those issues early, the people you're adding who can identify those issues early pales in comparison to the costs that are coming up if you don't, right? And that the example we just talked about right from the beginning with Optum, the New York insurance regulator is probing Optum for racial bias, right? And think what will come out of that. A bunch of fines. They have a few tools. Regulators have a few tools to their disposal. Fines, which is punitive, and additional regulation, which very few people, I'm sure, in this crowd want to deal with, right? You don't want regulators to be prescriptive, saying, hey, every system you develop has to have, you have to prove it's not biased between men and women, 50-50 or something like that, right? So that's something to think about when you're thinking about costs of additional human resources who can identify the problems that your regular project teams have not to date been able to identify before putting systems into production. Weigh them against the risks of big fines and extra regulation. And here's, again, the New York insurance regulator in particular, if you don't solve this problem, they will prescribe the solutions for you, right? And they'll start with, okay, so we know that there's a diversity problem in insurance companies and insurance companies implementing healthcare systems, right? And we're going to start with requiring you to publish your diversity data. And then, civil society organizations, other people will follow up and say, hey, look, this is these companies are not as diverse as these other ones, and they're the ones having most of the problems. So again, the costs, as I've talked about, of adding expertise to your project teams that'll identify those bias issues, identify those problems that your current project teams don't identify or can't identify because they don't have the expertise, against these costs, the costs of fines, big fines, and the costs of regulation, right, which limits revenues and so on. Okay, so maybe another opportunity to ask a set of questions, and I'm going to throw these out and see if anybody has any answers. So why were particular parameters and data sets used? Like, why was that proxy cost used? Why did the project team not understand the potential issues with the data and the application context? So why did the project manager not have project team members that can identify the problem, right? So if individual project team members can identify the problem, it's up to the project manager to have that expertise on the team to identify the problem. Even going one layer deeper, why did the human resources allocated to the project? Sometimes as a project manager, you're allocated a bunch of resources. You don't get to choose everybody on the team. So why did the human resources allocated to the project, again, not have the expertise to identify the issue, right? Or even awareness of the issues. The system went on in production. Remember, they didn't kind of stop it or identify it, early on during testing, and didn't even do the right kind of tests, right? And let's go even one layer deeper to the organizational level. So why did the organization implement that project without knowledge of bias issues required in AI and healthcare, right? So you see how I'm going through the different layers. Not just the data layer, got to go to the team member layer, to the project layer, to the human resources assigned to the project layer, to the organizational layer. Every one of these are decisions, management decisions. These are not technology decisions. These are management and business decisions, which is my main point of this whole workshop, right? The symptoms are what you see out there, like on that first question, but it came to be because of all these series of decisions that have taken place beforehand for the whole project. Anyway, so I put these questions out there. Anybody have any sort of answers, questions? Yeah, so somebody says, lazy, getting dirty. Yeah, so this is a problem, right? And you kind of hit one of the nails on the head. There are many nails to be hit in this workshop, but see that many times we will go for the free data sets, right? The free data sets or largest data sets or available data sets, right? What does that mean? That means 100% guarantee you will have a data set with bias, because human beings are biased. Human being decisions are biased. Any data set out there in the real world on anything has a bunch of biases, right? So if you're just using a data set that's out there, that's available or free, or you haven't kind of done that analysis, hey, what are the biases in this data set? Let's fix them and then use the data set. So in the areas where the implementations of AI have resulted in the most harm, like facial recognition technology, there are people developing and publishing those data sets which are less biased, or which can be used for testing of bias. That maybe be more accurate on that, right? So I won't say the data set is more or less biased, but at least it can be used for better testing, for testing of bias issues and so on. I haven't, in my experience, and maybe there are many healthcare sort of people and experts on this call, I haven't seen any healthcare data set that is published out there that has been truly tested for bias issues. I haven't seen it, not yet, right? So this is a healthcare industry issue. We haven't dealt with it yet. We just like facial recognition technology, kind of applications are dealing with it. It's coming soon. Natural language processing, NLP, going to be dealing with these issues. I'm seeing symptoms of that coming out in the academic literature. Hey, these are the bias issues that we're identifying in natural language processing, right? Speech to text, text to speech. So in healthcare, we haven't addressed this issue in our data sets that we use. I haven't seen, like I said, anybody publish a data set that has been tested for different kinds of bias, or saying, hey, this is why these are the biases in this data set, and this is what you want to test for when you're testing against your model. Not yet, right? Okay, any other comments or sort of answers to the questions that I've posed here? I'll just pause for a second. Interactive when we get to the end. Yeah, so absolutely. The question, healthcare data has a lot of implied or non-state assumptions. So back to that data sheets for data sets question, Timnit Gibru, some of you familiar with that concept. You got to know all the assumptions that went into collecting that data, how it was, who collected it, why they collected it, how it has been used. If you don't have information on all those questions, you're probably using a biased data set and you'll end up with biased results, right? In the organization, this is like not even just hammering the nail on the head. This is taking the sledgehammer that I want to bring out. In the organizational structure, who is accountable, in your opinion, for removing bias? And in this set of questions, the position I'm presenting is that everybody is. From that first question, says this is the data set we should use, right? Who's that decision maker, right? Probably an individual programmer, developer, data scientist. That person is responsible. The project team is responsible, right? So if that person is not identifying the problem, there got to be somebody on the team responsible for identifying the problem, saying, yeah, okay, that's fine using the data set, but recognize it has some biases and let's deal with them, and in terms of sampling, stratification, some of the suggestions made, so on, right? If the project team is not being able to identify the problem, who's the next level up? The project manager, right? So the project manager is the one that, hey, do we have the right people on this team to identify those issues? The project manager can't identify every issue. I've been project manager for like hundreds of projects. You cannot identify all the issues by yourself. You're dependent on your team to identify issues. And sometimes it requires having the right people on the team to identify the issues, right? So the next layer up is a project manager. Then I'll go one more layer up. So as I mentioned, projects exist in an organization. They're assigned resources, allocate resources based on the priority of the project. So that resource allocation takes place at a higher level than the project manager. Sometimes the project management office, sometimes higher between, mid-level managers or even executives. That allocation of human resources takes place, right? So in that allocation of human resources at the middle management level, at the departmental level, did people say, hey, do we have the right people for this project on that team? Who are we missing? What expertise are we missing? Do we have the people that can identify the bias issues? And then lastly, I will go one layer up to the organizational level, right? So we're talking to VP level, maybe even this year. So somebody said, hey, we want to do this project in healthcare, in hospitals. We're going to build this system. They don't know the nitty-gritty details of what data set or what the bias issues are. But when they've identified the incentives for this project, how many dollars is going to be associated for the project, what's going to be this overall, the broader schedule for the project, what are the objectives for this project? That's defined at a really high level, right? Not necessarily at a very low level, like overall broad objectives for the project. Like if somebody at the top or somebody defining those overall objectives said, hey, one of these objectives has to be, lack of bias between men and women or black and white patients or something like that. there's an objective that everybody in the project is going to work to. If it's a stated, explicit objective, and will come a little bit later, you have to be tied to incentives too, right? So that's a long answer to your question, which is why I have these questions, and my answer to your questions, everybody in the organization. Yeah. So somebody said, if you find bias, it's hard to correct. So even if you have people that identify the issue, right, you don't necessarily have an easy fix to it. It's not like you turn on the switch or change this parameter. In this particular case, actually, if you actually read the articles, it wasn't a simplistic fix to it. But I'll tell you maybe in the next section why the simplistic fixes are not enough. And so even if you identify the issue, I'm agreeing with the comment made there. Even if you have the team members that identify the issue, you not necessarily able to A, find an easy fix, B, have the resources to, invest in a more complicated fix. C, again, going back to those objectives, incentives, have the incentives to fix the issue, or the stated objectives, coming up from higher for the project to fix the issue, right? So again, I'm trying to convert you to it's not a technology issue. So you can identify the technology fix, the technology solution, but if you don't have the resources allocated to you to solve that problem, to implement that fix, to implement that solution, if you don't have in your project objectives that this is a goal we're working towards, in your incentive structures, if you're not incented to solve that problem, even if you identify the technological fix or solution, many cases it's not being addressed or not being fixed because of organizational issues, right? Management decisions, which is what I'm nudging you towards. Okay, so last section then, strategy and tactics. And again, I'm not going to present like the silver bullet answer, like, hey, this is the solution, magic solution. Turn this switch on and all your problems will be solved. Not true. I'm going to point to some directions, right? So, as I mentioned, in the particular case studies that I've presented so far, and I didn't present the fix because if I present the solution, you'll say, oh, that was easy. Once you identify the problem, the fix was easy. What I'm going to try and tell you here in this section, this is a pattern. This is not a one-off. This is not a one-off like Optum Healthcare individual organization issue. Here's another one, right? How an algorithm blocked kidney transplants to Black patients, right? That's another example of a healthcare AI issue. In this case, I should say maybe not an AI issue, an algorithmic issue, right? Here's another one from Google. They recently put a system out in production. That word is important. Out in production. It's not in the lab. They're not testing in the lab, find the issue in the lab, trying to fix it. It's already out in production. And then people call them out like, look, that system you've put out to detect skin conditions with your phone or some other camera is biased. It's not as accurate for people with darker skin. We know this problem exists in camera technology, right? In camera, both the hardware and the software. The trillion-dollar companies, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Amazon, haven't been able to solve this problem. So if somebody here has a quick fix to this, dark versus light skin issue in camera hardware and software technology, let me know. We'll make billions of dollars from the trillion-dollar companies, right? Nobody's come up with a good solution. They've put, as you know, many of them have put moratoriums on these systems until they can come up with a solution. I haven't read any news announcements saying, hey, we've come up with a completely unbiased system. Here it is. Not true. Hasn't happened yet, right? And remember, these are trillion-dollar companies. Think of the resources they have available to them to address this problem. Think of the revenues they could be making if they address this problem, right? So going back to this healthcare example with Google. So again, they put a system out in production in the last few months that was biased. It doesn't work as well for darker skin as just for lighter skin. So now they're looking for kind of, saying, hey, look, we can solve this problem even as a trillion-dollar company with all these resources. We can't solve this problem by ourselves. We're looking for help, and let's kind of work together to look for other measures of skin tones to curb bias. So when we, develop and put other systems out in production and generate revenues from them, we, at least have hopefully have addressed this issue, right? So it's not often the solution is not a simple technological fix. If there was, we'd have these companies selling, not having these kinds of issues. A $1 trillion company would not put a product out like this, biased product out like this, if they had figured out the solutions to the problem, right? So I presented the kind of long form example of that Optum product. I presented this example as a different example, saying, hey, look, this is not a one-off. This is a trend in the industry, the healthcare industry, right? Present this recent one saying, hey, it's not just about small companies or, insurance companies doing software. It's like a software company doing software that has this issue. And here's where I want to take you. So you can see that the number of incidents, and this is a repository that somebody's created of AI and algorithmic. So it's not just AI and algorithmic incident and controversy repository. Look at the numbers. In everybody's seen that graph, with the academic articles and bias, when in the beginning it says, hey, bias, what's that? And now it's like, oh, right? So I'm not going to present that graph. What I'm presenting to you is news articles out there, right? So it's not about the number of academic articles. It's about the number of issues and incidents, of AI bias, algorithmic bias issues. Bias exists not only in AI, right? And it exists in plain vanilla algorithms as well, right? Non-AI, plain vanilla algorithms. So you look at the numbers, right? 36 incidents in 2018, 73 in 2019, 205 in 2020. 2021, 159 so far. Guaranteed it'll beat 200 by the end of the year, right? So you're seeing this pattern. And people say, oh, well, you've pointed out some examples here, like this one and the long form case study they use. That doesn't happen in my company. I'm like, probably because you haven't tested your systems for bias, right? Because it's like this here is your considered, like, so I've been a project manager for most of my life, right? So this is your repository of projects, of failed projects, right? Don't have to have them inside your company. Look at what's going on externally in your industry, right? In this sector. This is your repository of failed projects. Learn from them. Don't, this is why you have project repositories, not just the successes, but also the failures. You learn from both successes and failures, hopefully get better and better projects, better products and services, and so on. So learn from these examples that are out there. Otherwise, guaranteed, if your products are not already sort of on this list of issues, you will find yourself in a news article on a list like this, right? So just another list. So and the details are not important. This is specific to AI, right? So that other list, a bit broader, algorithms, non-AI algorithms as well. This list is specific to AI, talking about the incidents on AI. So again, my point being, this is a pattern, right? It's not a one-off. It's not a company-specific issue. It's a pattern across the industry. Be aware of it, learn from it, learn from other people's mistakes. This is what we kind of do, right? Learn from other people's mistakes and fix these mistakes as best as you can within your own company, within your own organization. All right, so I'm going to throw you another curveball, right? So far, maybe you say, okay, maybe there's some convincing arguments on diversity. There's that business case for diversity. This is before AI, right? When I talk about, I'll go back to it just to illustrate it. Here, this study by McKinsey across thousands of companies across many countries, many different industries. This is not even about AI, right? So there's a benefit to diversity just broadly, and the business case has been made. And I'm just providing one example. This is like a dozen studies by a dozen organizations saying the same thing. So I'm going to go back to the slide I was on. And you may say, okay, so maybe you have made a useful argument that we need diversity on project teams to the kind of diversity, the cognitive diversity, right? That to identify those issues of bias that we're not identifying right now. And yes, it has a cost. Adding human resources to any project has a cost, but maybe it's worthwhile to add those human resources to those projects, because the alternative, if you don't, is you're facing that risk of big, huge, because you're putting systems out in production that are biased, that big, huge fines from regulators and prescriptive regulations, right? Neither of which anybody here wants. Here's the curveball I'm gonna throw at you. So you say, okay, so we'll, going forward, maybe I'll see what I can do in my sphere of influence to increase kind of diversity on my project teams, on the projects I work on, the ones under my purview. The curveball I'm gonna throw at you is, again, simply diversifying those teams without changing anything about your culture in an organization. Your efforts at increasing diversity will fall flat. And here's the data that indicates the issue. So this is, maybe many of you are in Toronto, and some of you are not. That's okay. You will find similar data in your city if you look at the reports coming out for your cities. So this particular survey asks questions, and importantly, and somebody had mentioned, stratifies it, right? Against sort of Asian, Black, non-white, and gender kind of as a men, woman as well, right? So here are the types of questions the survey asked. When tasks that no one person is responsible for need to get done, the tasks are divided fairly, right? And here's the trend. The last question there on this particular slide, I'm part of the decision-making process at work. So just think about how important that diversity piece is to sort of decision-making on projects, right? On the project level, right? On sort of, being distribution of tasks, right? And what's the trend that you notice here? Anybody, can you identify the one group that consistently is, reports a lower rating than all other groups? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Thank you. Yes. Again, City of Toronto, as we claim, multicultural center of the most multicultural city in the world. Black employees across organizations are not feeling, compared to that, so it's a comparison, right? Compared to other groups of employees, not feeling that the tasks are being divided equally, or they're part of the decision-making process. So when we go through this, there's like two more like this. Think about that. Hey, we've diversified our teams. We've got Asian, white, Black, and whoever else we need to on our team. And you haven't changed anything about the culture of the organization. What are the people on those teams generally feeling based on who they are? So here's another one. I feel comfortable to voice my opinion, even when it differs from the group opinion. Think about how that important it is when you're debating ideas like issues like bias in AI, right? So, hey, excuse me, I think you have a problem in this data set, or your model, or the combination of the model and the data set, right? And so whose opinion is heard and whose opinion is ignored? Again, the trend across every question, you can see who is not feeling heard, right? Whose opinion is not being heard. And so I'm encouraged to be innovative, even though some of the things I try may fail, right? So think about, again, how important it is on the types of projects we're talking about, implementing AI in healthcare. Important for everybody on the team to have that voice on innovation, not just the voice on issue AI bias and risks, but also, hey, I have an enhancement to suggest, or a way we can do things better, and whose feeling their voices are not being heard, right? So this is a culture issue, again, not a technology issue. It's a culture issue, right? In tech, particularly this survey was done on tech companies in Toronto. Yeah, last one. So yeah, my company values the differences in individuals. My company represents a diverse group of talent. And you can see that trend across the board consistently. Black employees in Toronto are not feeling it. And yeah, you will find, if you look at this same data for your city, for your local context, you will find the same. If as long as tech, this is the tech problem, right? It's a tech industry problem. You look at any survey of tech, you will find similar results, exact same, similar results. So going back to the point I was trying to make here, that yeah, so just diversifying, just adding bodies, different bodies that look different, without changing that culture, without making that culture inclusive, without making sure that everybody's decisions, opinions are being heard, the risks they're raising are being addressed, the innovations or enhancements they're suggesting are being heard. If you haven't changed that culture, just diversifying the bodies in the room, not going to fix the problem, right? Because those ideas, those thoughts, those issues, the risks are not going to be addressed, right? So I know that was a curveball, but I'm trying to get you to delayer these issues, right? Think deeply, think deeper than like most people are thinking right now, saying, oh, it's just a data problem. No, it's not just a data problem. It's a diversity problem. B, it's a company organizational culture problem, right? All right, so we have 12 minutes, and these are my questions to you. Again, so having presented what I presented and making that case for diversity, making that case for, gradual and slow, maybe organizational, the diversity question you can solve quickly, or early, I should say. But the organizational culture takes time, much more slower process, but still also necessary. Here are my questions to you. And many of you have these roles, project managers, senior managers, executives. What would you do differently as a project manager? What, based on that case study, now that you have been presented with some directions and solutions, and trends across the industry, what would you do differently as a senior manager or executive? What types of diversity and expertise do we need on AI project teams? Is it just physical appearance? And my suggestion is obviously not. Look at what I presented in terms of Scott Galloway, talking about cognitive diversity. You need people, in addition to being maybe bodily different, need people who think different. And look at what I said about Abhishek Gupta, who talked specifically about healthcare AI examples, and how he talks about that different kinds of expertise needed on the team. Would the last point I made, would diversity of project team members by itself address the issues in the case study? And here's the organizational issues. What are the role of organizational incentive structures in identifying the issues of the case study? Are people incented to identify the issues? Even if you identify the issues, are you incented to solve them? Is that part of the objectives of the project, right? Is that what you get paid for? Do you get a bonus? If you typically you get a bonus if you finish maybe a project early, or even on time, or something like that. But do you get a bonus for solving bias issues? 99% of companies you don't. So if that incentive is not there, why would people do what you get paid to do, right? So if that incentive structure, financial incentive, is not there to solve the bias issues, you're not going to solve them. You're not incented to do so, right? And then lastly, what is the role of organizational culture? It's that slow moving pace, right, in identifying the issues. Okay, so we have 10 minutes. I'll put a whole bunch of questions for you to answer. I can answer questions. I'll see what comes up in chat. You can raise your hand. You can type something in the chat. Somebody says, have diversity be part of the early process in creating. Absolutely. So, which is my number one recommendation. So you say, okay, so you've made a bunch of recommendations. What's your number one and kind of first recommendation? It's that, so what somebody pointed out, have diversity be part of the early process in creating any AI, not just in healthcare, right? Anywhere. Because having that diversity, having people who not just look different, but also think different, will make it more likely that you're identifying the potential issues that'll come up, that otherwise we wouldn't be putting these systems on in production. Like all these examples I use, including Google putting bias systems out in production. Forget about in the lab, in testing, whatever, out in production, out in the wild, out in, the world. Maybe in the healthcare example, the case study, having sold the system and revenues from it is not just, again, like a test system or something like this. That system was sold and was in use. And then the researcher said, hey, Houston, we have a problem, right? External researcher came along and pointed out the problem, right? Yeah. So other comments. I know I've presented a lot of information and maybe presented things that in a way that other people don't. And I'm pointing the finger much higher up that organizational chain that other people do. Other people kind of keep talking about the data. I'm like, no, it's much more than the data. It's a series of decisions that have taken place before even the first human resource was assigned, who selected the data set, the decision, a lot of decisions on incentives for the project, objectives of the project were made before that. So I'm pointing my finger up that organizational chain, right? To the decision that get made before the project, for the project, during the project, of course, right? Yeah. So any other comments or questions? There's a question about near infrared. Yeah. So I mean, so there's different, and I'm not an expert in camera technologies, but there's different camera technologies, right? And so the ones that are getting into trouble are the facial recognition ones, the ones being used to detect people's faces and used for whatever purpose, sometimes for a really negative purpose, like people have actually been jailed. Three, as of last week, 3 people have been convicted or jailed because wrongful, identification by facial recognition. So, and all 3, here's the point, all 3 individuals are Black, right? So facial recognition not working for darker faces, and having a negative content. It's not just about, hey, oh, so it's a minor inconvenience. It's not a minor inconvenience. Like 3 people have gone to wrongfully went to jail, and they're, obviously their convictions overturned in court. But that's the consequence of getting it really wrong. So think about, again, the consequence in healthcare, how not having the right interventions, the right care, because of a biased algorithm can, result in debilitating healthcare conditions, theoretically in the long-term death, right? Yeah. So again, I'll pause for any more questions or comments. So somebody said, looks like the organization said it's monetary, dollar value. Is there a way to get a dollar value of slowing the production until all efforts are put in to make systems? Yeah. So where I'm agreeing with you very strongly is that many of the organizational incentives as to why these systems get put out in production without addressing the bias issue, it's monetary. It comes down to the monetary incentive. But my proposition to you, and I'll go back to this, and yeah, this is my contact information. I'll bring it up back later. You can contact me through LinkedIn, Google my name, you'll find me. I work at York and I do research at U of T. I'm going to go back to answer Huda's question by doing it in this way. Okay, so how about the other side of the financial disincentives? So if you're putting out these systems, and if you're not doing, as you mentioned, slowing it down, adding those additional human resources to your team that identifies all those issues across race, gender, disability, ability, and so on. If you're not adding those expertise to your team, not slowing it down to identify the issues, you will put out a system in production like Optum did, and you will face hundreds, maybe millions of dollars in fines by the regulator, right? Because, outside the world of AI, there are laws that says you cannot discriminate, right? By race, by gender, by disability, and so on, right? So you essentially, you put a system out there that was discriminatory. Even if you claim, oh, I didn't know it was discriminatory, that's not an excuse anymore, right? Because as I mentioned, there's hundreds and hundreds of these incidents coming up, as we go along. So it's not about, hey, I didn't know. What did you not know? What did you not research, right? So going back to this particular point, the dollar cost, the financial cost of fines And even as many of you know, many of you work in AI, you will be not pro-regulation, will be anti, because it's stifle, it limits innovation, right? So this, sorry, I kind of flipped. This heavy-handed prescriptive regulations that are coming, they're not, it's at this point, it's not like, okay, it's not coming. If we fix all the problems of bias in the industry, they're coming anyways, because what the government is seeing, the citizens are seeing, and therefore the regulations are a reflection of the citizens' sort of perspectives. The regulators implement new regulations when the citizens, complain about a bunch of things. So the number of complaints. So I just showed you like hundreds of lists of news articles. For each news article, there's like 100 complaints by the people that are wronged or have been harmed, right? Or thousands of complaints, right? So the regulators going to start prescribing things. The regulators in different industries across the board. In this particular case study, I'm pointing to the insurance regulator because that's who the company kind of gets regulated by, are going to start prescribing regulations. Say, you guys can't fix this as an industry, we'll prescribe it for you at a huge additional cost as a limitation of revenue. So, trade off those costs. I see another question. Why don't you just train for the different cultures instead of having one system like a triage? Not clear on that question, Marcia. So, but something I didn't mention in terms of the whole diversity piece is that, and maybe this question set is relevant. So can you, on your project teams, on your existing project teams, can you train people to identify these issues instead of hiring that expertise, instead of employing that extra expertise, adding that extra human resource, that cost? Can you train people? And my question back to you is, knowing from all the data scientists and computer scientists that I know, have any of them have any formal training in identifying these issues? It's coming, more and more, courses on bias, identifying bias and all these issues in computer science departments, in data science departments. It's coming. So as a long-term fix, I agree. It's not just the problem to be fixed by hiring a specialized resource. The problem has to be fixed by everybody understanding the issues. And that takes often formal training back in school. When you're doing school, when you're learning how to develop the system, part of the developing the system is developing an unbiased system, right? Or less biased system anyways. So that training is coming, it's emerging. That's a long-term fix, like a decades-long fix. Short-term, gotta hire those resources to fix the problem. Okay, it's 12 o'clock and I will maybe, and as I mentioned, feel free to put my contact information up here. Feel free to contact me by email, by LinkedIn. Happy to answer any questions. And just as a note, I use this, as I mentioned, I teach at York, so I use this as a case study for my business students, both MBA graduate students and undergrads. And I have a whole bunch of these for every sector. Yeah, lots of examples, no shortage of examples of bias issues in the industry. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for a great workshop, Ushnish. Just a reminder to everybody, the workshop is recorded and they will be shared just after the summit. Thanks, everyone.